Railways, water, gas, electricity, steel, coal, and telecommunications. These are the industries that built modern Britain. They were privatised over the course of 18 years, generating £69 billion in revenue and transforming the country into the proving ground for one of the most radical economic experiments of the 20th century. This is the story of how Britain privatised its industries, what happened next, and why, 4 decades later, the country is now trying to buy some of them back. To understand why Britain privatised almost everything, you have to understand what Britain looked like before. After the Second World War, Clement Attlee's Labour government nationalised the backbone of the British economy. Electricity, gas, coal, steel, railways, these weren't just businesses, they were instruments of national recovery. The state would own them, run them, and use them to rebuild a shattered country. And for 3 decades, that's essentially what happened. By the late 1970s, though, the arrangement was showing deep cracks. Nationalised industries accounted for 10% of the economy and 14% of all capital investment, and many were losing staggering amounts of money. British Steel required over £1 billion in a single financial year on a turnover of just under £3 billion, a loss so spectacular it earned the company a place in the Guinness Book of Records. Taxpayers were pouring an average of £600 million a year into British Steel alone between 1979 and 1986. Then came the winter of discontent. Strikes paralysed the country. Rubbish piled up in the streets. The dead, in some cases, went unburied. When Margaret Thatcher won the general election in May 1979, she carried with her a mandate for change. But here's what most people don't realise. Privatisation was barely mentioned in the Conservative manifesto. It was a minor footnote. The revolution happened almost by accident. The intellectual groundwork had been laid years earlier, largely out of public view. The Institute of Economic Affairs, a free market think tank founded in 1955, had spent 2 decades arguing that state ownership was inherently inefficient. The Centre for Policy Studies, co-founded by Thatcher herself alongside Keith Joseph and Alfred Sherman, translated those ideas into actionable policy. Sherman, in particular, was the intellectual street fighter who pushed the most radical thinking into the mainstream of conservative thought. Their arguments drew heavily on the work of economists F.A. Hayek and Milton Friedman, both of whom had long contended that markets allocate resources more efficiently than governments ever could. By the time Thatcher entered Downing Street, this intellectual framework was ready and waiting. John Redwood, who ran Thatcher's policy unit, later admitted that Thatcher herself initially thought privatisation was wacky. He had to personally make the case to convince her. Geoffrey Howe, her first Chancellor of the Exchequer and a Mont Pelerin Society member, was more instinctively sympathetic to the free market agenda from the outset. But once Thatcher was convinced, there was no turning back. British Aerospace went first in 1981, followed by Cable and Wireless that same year. These were test runs, proof of concept. The real revolution began on a grey November day in 1984, when British Telecom was offered to the public. The BT privatisation was unlike anything the world had ever seen. The company was valued at around £8 billion, and for context, the largest share offering in history at that point had been the $500 million sale of AT&T in the United States. It dwarfed it. The privatisation bill spent more time being debated in the House of Commons than any piece of legislation since the Second World War, 320 hours. When the shares finally went on sale at 130 pence each, more than 2 million people bought them, and the offering was oversubscribed by 4 times. That was the moment privatisation as we know it was invented. It paved the way for what became a torrent of mass market sell-offs, not just in Britain, but around the world. 2 years later came British Gas, and with it, one of the most memorable advertising campaigns in British history. Tell Sid. The ads featured ordinary people searching for a man named Sid, desperate to let him know he could buy shares in the newly privatized gas company. 4 million people applied, 1.5 million landed shares, and the flotation raised £5.6 billion, the largest global equity offering in history at that time. An investment of £100 in British Gas back then would be worth over £1,200 today, not counting dividends. British Airways followed in 1987, then British Petroleum that same year, raising over $12 billion and surpassing British Gas as the largest British privatisation to date. British Steel came in 1988. The same company that had been hemorrhaging £1 billion a year just 7 years earlier was now profitable enough to repay the government. Nigel Lawson, as Chancellor throughout much of this period, oversaw the fiscal architecture that made the flotations work, structuring the sales to maximise both revenue and popular participation. Water utilities followed in 1989, electricity in 1990. By the time Thatcher was ousted from office in November 1990, more than 40 state-owned businesses employing 600,000 workers had been transferred to private hands. The share of employment in nationalised industries had fallen from 9% to under 2%. The number of individual shareholders in Britain had roughly tripled, making the country second only to the United States. Between 1980 and 1996, Britain accounted for 40% of the total value of all assets privatised across the entire OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, whose own subsequent research would become central to evaluating whether any of it actually worked. This wasn't just a British policy, it was a British export. John Major kept the programme going after Thatcher's departure. He privatised British Coal in 1995, the old National Coal Board, once the largest employer in Britain, and British Rail in 1996. Rail privatisation created a fragmented structure. Railtrack, a private company, would own and manage the infrastructure, while separate operating franchises would run the trains. It was an arrangement that would end in disaster, and by 1997, nationalised industries accounted for just 2% of GDP, down from 10%. Public sector employment had fallen by over 1.5 million. The revenues were enormous. £69 billion flowed into the Treasury between 1979 and 1997, allowing successive Conservative governments to maintain public spending while simultaneously cutting taxes. It was, from a fiscal perspective, an extraordinary trick. Sell the assets once, use the windfall to balance the books, but assets can only be sold once. And that's where the story turns, because the question was never just whether privatisation would raise money. The real question was whether it would deliver better services, lower prices, and greater accountability. On that front, the record is deeply contested. Start with water. England's water utilities were privatised in 1989, and in the 34 years since, the privatised water industry accumulated £73 billion in long-term debt, while paying out £88.4 billion in dividends to shareholders. In 2024, pollution incidents surged by 30%, totaling nearly 2,500 cases, the highest in a decade and double the Environment Agency's permitted limit. Despite this, water companies distributed £1.2 billion to shareholders that same year. The energy regulator Ofgem, meanwhile, has faced parallel questions about its effectiveness in protecting consumers as energy bills spiraled, a pattern that suggests the problem extends well beyond water. Thames Water became the symbol of everything critics say went wrong. The company is drowning under £19 billion in debt and has been fined £123 million by the regulator Ofwat, the largest penalty ever administered, including £104 million for sewage spills and £18 million for paying unjustified dividends. In late 2023 and early 2024, Thames Water paid out nearly £200 million in dividends, while its customers faced bill increases of 40%. When American private equity firm KKR walked away from a rescue deal in June 2025, renationalization became a genuine possibility, and by mid-2026, with a contested £10 billion creditor restructuring package under scrutiny, and the Environment Secretary publicly expressing concern, Thames Water moved a step closer to returning to public hands. Then there's the question of who actually owns these privatized industries. EDF Energy, one of Britain's largest electricity providers, is wholly owned by the French government, a reminder that the French state was happy to buy assets that the British state had decided it shouldn't own. Scottish Power belongs to the Spanish company Iberdrola, itself majority state influenced in its origins. Of the big six energy companies, only British Gas remains under British ownership. Governments in Germany, the Netherlands, and France hold stakes in companies running over a dozen UK rail franchises. Britain privatised its industries, and foreign governments bought them. And then there's Railtrack, the private company responsible for maintaining Britain's rail infrastructure, collapsed in 2001 after a series of fatal accidents. Most notably, the Hatfield crash of 2000 exposed catastrophic underinvestment. It was taken back into a not-for-profit public body, Network Rail, under the Blair government. The franchise model limped on for another 2 decades, but the Railtrack collapse permanently damaged the intellectual case for rail privatisation and planted the seed of what is now a full reversal. Public opinion has shifted dramatically. 76% of Britons now favour publicly operated railways. Support for water nationalisation stands at 82%, up 23 percentage points since 2017. For energy companies, the figure is 71%, Royal Mail 75%. Even among Conservative voters, 58% say water should be in public hands. The Labour government elected in 2024 has begun acting on that sentiment. The Passenger Railway Services Public Ownership Act received royal assent in November 2024. South Western Railway became the first operator brought back under public control in May 2025, followed by C2C and Greater Anglia. By mid-2026, around 80% of all passenger journeys that Great British Railways will ultimately oversee are being delivered by publicly owned operators. A new public body, Great British Railways, will eventually manage the entire network. Royal Mail, privatised in 2013 after 499 years of public ownership in what Labour called a first-class disaster, saw its shares jump 38% on the first day of trading, a windfall that went to private investors rather than the taxpayer. Since privatisation, shareholders of formerly public industries have received nearly £200 billion. Researchers estimate a privatisation premium of roughly £250 per household per year, the additional cost consumers pay compared to what public ownership might have delivered. So was it worth it? The honest answer is that it depends on when you ask, what you measure, and who's paying. Privatisation unquestionably modernised industries that had become inefficient and politically captured. It generated enormous revenues and created a shareholder culture that didn't exist before. But it also created a system where essential services, water from your tap, the train you take to work, the electricity that heats your home, are run for profit by entities with no particular loyalty to the people who depend on them. Britain spent 18 years selling its industries. It may spend the next 18 buying some of them back. And the irony is that both the selling and the buying will be paid for by exactly the same people, the British public.